Hi, this is Lou, welcome to my channel, and today I'm playing with the idea of horizon. So I'm doing a whole series of paintings that are really abstracted landscapes. And last week's painting was inspired by a piece I'd been reading in a book, but I also want to create some work that's inspired by getting out and seeing the world and experiencing it and coming back with some ideas from it. So I've been doing quite a lot of walks recently with my beautiful companion around the Edinburgh area and the kind of the coast around here. It's actually a river, it's the Forth, but sometimes you can't see the other side, it's quite wide. So I've been enjoying some walks on the beaches, and as I've been going I've been taking a few photographs and just noticing a few things. And the simple thing that I came away with from a recent walk is that creating a landscape often involves drawing a really simple, strong horizon line and then filling in the details from there. So that's what I want to do today. So I started with a little page in my sketchbook, and I'm just going to do a little thumbnail and see where it goes. So I started by taping off the margins, filling in a whole area pretty much with some indigo watercolour, and then painting in that quite a strong horizon line. My goal with this series, the horizon that I want to keep in mind, is creating final works, finished pieces. So I'm doing a lot of sketchbook work and sketching and making small pieces on paper, but I'm trying to keep in mind what a finished product could be. Where is it intended for? What do I want it to achieve? And so I'll be working small in some of these videos, but in some of them, like today's, I want to scale things up and work a little larger. So I'm working on small pieces in my sketchbook as preliminary ideas that I can take onto a bigger stage. I've been playing with these lines for years. A really simple straight horizon line made with a ruler. And then lines drawn either above or below it, in this case below, that I draw freehand and slowly allow to undulate. The process of drawing them is really about focusing on the line that you're drawing and the one that you drew before, and trying to keep the gap between the lines about the same at the same point as you're drawing it. As you go, some of the gaps can start to get a little bit bigger in places, and some of them get a little bit smaller. And over the course of drawing, over 2 or 3 or 4 or 20 lines, those larger areas become wider undulations, and the smaller areas become shallower ones. And you end up with more and more detail as the lines get closer and closer to you. And I think this mimics the way that you see landscapes, with less detail in the distance and much more when you're up close. In this case, the lines also mimic the waves of the sea and the ridges in the sand. Having worked on this at a small scale now, it's time to scale it up and to work on a bigger piece of paper. For some in this series, I'm going to be working with acrylic on canvas. I might even go to even larger pieces of watercolour paper, because the goal that I have in mind is that I want to create art that looks good in a room, essentially. I want to be able to see it framed and to see it hung up on a wall, in a gallery, or in a domestic space. I also want to create work that's meaningful to me, that comes from something that's really personal, but can speak to something universal in all of us. So to start with scaling things up, I'm working in a very similar way to what I did in my sketchbook. I'm marking a nice even border around the page, and I'm taping it with masking tape. When I'm working small, I can take a space like a square in a sketchbook, paint around the edges, fill in the centre, and I know that it's pretty much going to be wet, equally wet all the way through, and that my colours will flow nice and evenly and gently. But working with something this size, I knew that that would be really difficult to do. So I decided to coat the whole of my open area in between the masking tape with some water. So I've got a big flat brush and I'm just using water to fill in that whole area. This is where I encountered the first problem with scaling up. Working with a very wet piece of paper at this scale, I'd wet the centre and not the edges, and you can see that the paper's starting to buckle. So I decided to try and wet the edges of the paper as well, so I used a spray bottle to try and wet the edges of the back of the paper in the hopes that that would kind of buckle them in the same way as the front. I'm not really sure what I was trying to achieve here, but I made a mental note to try stretching the paper properly next time, rather than relying on this sort of method. I just wanted to work with one colour. So I've got my plate that I'm using as a palette and I'm squidging out a good amount of indigo paint onto it. This is a really nice, quite strong colour, so I should be able to get some depth of the colour. Just adding a little bit of water to it. There's already water on the page, so it should move nicely. And then all I'm going to do is just draw that horizon line in. Spread the paint out backwards and forwards, and then see if I can help it to move. But I'm just going to keep drawing the horizon line in, backwards and forwards, and then give the paint a little bit of help to spread down the page. I'm doing that by lifting it, and hopefully the paper should be wet enough that that paint painted at the horizon line should start to slowly make its way down the page. And I just repeat that process quite a lot of times. Adding in my nice strong line of indigo at the top, lifting the page and encouraging that paint downwards. I also help it a little bit on its way by using the spray bottle again. This is when I realised mistake number 2, which is that I should have taped all the way to the edges of the paper if I wanted to keep them nice and clean. I did get a little bit of overspray on them. After applying a third line of the thick indigo paint and a little bit more water from the spray bottle, I encouraged even more paint down the page. And this time I was able to get it right to the bottom of that taped off square. You might notice I've got a few slightly blanker areas, so I tried to add a little bit more paint to those places, especially that stripe down the left. See if I could encourage a bit more paint down in those areas. And finally the whole of the bottom kind of 3/4 of that square was full of runny, drippy, lovely paint. This is what it looks like wet, but I know it's going to dry later. So you'll see that in a second. So there we are. I've got some lovely kind of cloudy, soft marks in there that I'm really enjoying. And I do take the tape off and notice that I've got a little bit of a line from some of that overspray. Also my paper is a little warped, but I can fix that later. I'll have to decide what I'm going to do about the edges. I could use this as an experiment to mount onto a wooden panel, and that would remove those edges, but it does feel a bit of a waste of paper. I can always use them for swatching or thumbnails, testing out paints, so nothing ever really goes to waste. I'm going to add the same lines as I did with the tiny little version in my sketchbook. And so I mark the point where I want them to start on both sides. And I decide I want to leave a border around it of the darker colour. So again, I use some tape and tape that off. I've got something new to try here. This is the first time I've used it, apart from a few test swipes. And I know that this piece isn't going to be perfect, because the first time you use anything new, it never quite goes to plan. What this is a little thin needle-tipped applicator bottle. And I bought a little set of them. I can put different colours in. And inside it is some fluid titanium white paint with a little bit of water to help it flow even more. And I'm drawing on here the same lines that I drew with the white pen in my sketchbook. And I'm hoping that this gives them a little bit more vibrancy against the page. Also, I like the idea of using these little applicator bottles so I can put different colours in. So I'm not limited by what colours I've got. I can mix up any colour I fancy. But for this I did want to use the white. I am aware that I've got those lovely marks on there and I'm going to be covering them up, pretty much. So I'll just have to see how it looks when I'm finished. I'm hoping that you'll still see the kind of the traces of them, the little kind of ghostly presences. And I did have a few little teething troubles with this bottle. A few little gaps that were skipped. I found that my lines weren't as even and consistent as I'd like them to be. And I did have a couple of times where it all clogged up and I had to go and rinse the whole thing out, take the cap off, stick a little pin in it, jiggle it backwards and forwards. I think it's because I was using old paint that had been sat around for a long time and it had some clumpy bits in it. I also had a bit where it kind of splurted a big blob right in the middle of one of my lines, which I wasn't too happy about. But then, doing pieces like this, I don't know, do I want them to be perfect? Surely the idea is that I'm doing them freehand with kind of analogue tools, and I want there to be a little bit of interest and difference and unusualness in there. So I feel like when I'm drawing these things, there are always some things that don't quite go to plan. You might call them mistakes, I'm not sure if I do. They're definitely not planned, they're definitely not what I intended. And sometimes it's the case that actually I really don't like them and I scrap the whole piece. But most of the time I go, okay, right, that wasn't what I wanted, but maybe we can live with it. And then sometimes at the end, those are the bits I like the best. There's something about doing these repetitive marks and making very, very simple shapes over and over that allows my mind, and I believe other artists as well, to process things in a different way. And making these, the process of it, gives you insight into yourself and your practice that you wouldn't have had otherwise. I feel like this is an experimental piece, but it also feels very personal. So this piece is about horizon, kind of seeing ahead, seeing the whole scope of everything. But actually that's something that I found really difficult. I find it difficult to see a big picture. I really want to focus on the individual small details in life. What making this piece has sort of told me is that it's okay not to have the whole picture. It's okay not to know where the horizon is, but just to focus on exactly what's right in front of you, what you're drawing at the minute, what you're making at the minute. And there's an element of trust in knowing that actually it will end up being part of a bigger whole that will all make sense and be cohesive. And the horizon, the big picture, doesn't necessarily have to be in view the whole time. So I decided this piece needed something a little extra to finish it off. And so I decided to add in a moon or a sun, maybe a moon. I used some acrylic size and a little brush to paint in my semicircle that I'd marked in pencil. This is what my gold leaf will stick to. Or in this case, I decided that it would be better as silver. So the way this works is that it's a glue that you're painting on, and it dries, but it still stays tacky. So that when it's dried down, your metal leaf will still stick to it. I try and get the surface as smooth as possible with my little brush, so I don't end up with any kind of obvious lumps in my final gold leaf area or silver leaf area. Adhering it is as simple as placing the little sheet over the glued area, making sure it's all nicely covered. Start by pulling away some of the excess, rubbing it down with my finger, and then using a soft brush to get rid of the rest. So here's my final piece, but I think it still needs a little bit more work. But as an experiment, I think I learned an awful lot from making this. So let's see where it takes me next. So thanks so much for joining me today. I hope that you've found this interesting. If you give this project a go, then maybe try and avoid the mistakes that I did. But maybe they weren't mistakes at all. Learning experiences, that's what we'll call them. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, bye bye.